The world can break a heart in a single moment, and mend it just as quickly, though Eleanor Ashworth did not yet know this truth on the grey April afternoon when her life would begin its slow, inexorable turn towards something she had long ceased to believe possible. The rain had stopped an hour before, leaving Hyde Park washed clean and glistening, the stones of the pathway dark with moisture, the leaves of the ancient oaks still heavy with droplets that fell like tears when the wind stirred their branches. Eleanor sat alone on a bench, partially hidden by shrubbery near the Serpentine, her grey dress marking her as a woman of reduced circumstances, though anyone who looked closely might have noticed the quality of its cut, the quiet elegance that poverty had not yet stripped from her bearing. She had come here because it was the anniversary of her father's death, because this was the path where Jonathan Ashworth had walked with her when she was a child, pointing out the ducks and the swans, and telling her stories of the ships that had made his fortune, ships that now lay at the bottom of distant seas, along with every hope she had once harboured for her future. The grief had overtaken her without warning, rising up from some deep place she thought she had sealed away, and now she wept with her gloved hand pressed to her mouth to stifle the sound. Her large grey eyes swimming with tears, she could not stop, her chestnut hair beginning to slip from its careful chignon as her shoulders shook. She did not hear the approaching footsteps, did not notice the tall figure of the man walking with a small boy, until a child's voice, clear and carrying in the rain-washed air, pierced through her private sorrow. "Papa, why is that lady crying?" the boy asked, and Eleanor's head came up sharply, mortification flooding through her as she met the eyes of a stranger. "She looks like Mamma did in her portrait, but sadder." The man had frozen mid-stride, his hand still clasping his son's smaller one, and Eleanor found herself staring into eyes of such deep blue they appeared almost black, set in a face of severe aristocratic beauty, dark hair silvered at the temples, broad shoulders held with the rigid control of a man unaccustomed to displaying emotion. She knew him, or knew of him, as did everyone in society, for this was the Duke of Ashworth, the cold widower, the man whose first wife had died in scandal, and who had not smiled since, if the whispers were to be believed. Their eyes held for a long, suspended moment, and Eleanor saw something flicker in his gaze, something that might have been recognition of a kindred wound, before she rose abruptly, her cheeks burning with shame, and murmured an apology that came out barely above a whisper. She fled before he could speak, her boots splashing through puddles she did not see, aware only of the need to escape, to hide, to nurse her humiliation in private, as she had nursed every other wound these past 3 years. Behind her, the Duke of Ashworth stood motionless on the rain-slicked path, watching her retreat until she disappeared from view, and when his son tugged at his hand and asked if they should help the sad lady, he found he had no answer to give. Eleanor returned to her lodgings as the last grey light of afternoon faded into evening, her grey dress damp at the hem from puddles she had not bothered to avoid in her haste to escape the park, and Harriet Dalton was waiting for her at the door of their modest sitting-room, her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's pallor, the tracks of tears still visible on her cheeks, the way her chestnut hair had slipped further from its careful chignon during her flight through the streets. "Come, child," Harriet said, her voice carrying that particular blend of briskness and tenderness that had been Eleanor's comfort since childhood, and she guided her former charge to the worn chair nearest the meagre fire, pressing a handkerchief into her trembling hands. The room was small, the furniture shabby but clean, the wallpaper faded to an indeterminate shade that might once have been rose or might once have been cream, and outside the single window the rain had begun again, pattering against the glass with a sound like whispered secrets, like tears falling on stone. Eleanor told Harriet everything, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, how she had gone to Hyde Park because it was the anniversary of her father's death, because Jonathan Ashworth had walked those very paths with her when she was a girl, pointing out the swans and telling her stories of the ships that bore his name across distant oceans, ships that now lay broken on foreign shores, along with every dream she had ever harboured. She told Harriet how the grief had overtaken her without warning, how she had wept on that bench like a child, and how she had been discovered in her weakness by a gentleman and his son, a small boy who had asked with innocent clarity why she was crying, who had said she looked sadder than his mother in her portrait. "The Duke of Ashworth," Harriet said quietly, and Eleanor nodded, fresh shame burning in her cheeks, for she had recognized him even through her tears. The cold widower whose tragic story was whispered in every drawing-room, and now he had seen her at her lowest, a weeping woman in a grey dress with nothing left to her name but her dignity, and she had lost even that. The conversation turned, as it always did in these dark evenings, to the circumstances that had brought them to these cramped rooms, to her father's death 6 months past, and the final collapse of the debts that had been mounting since the loss of his ships, to the sale of their home and the dispersal of their servants, and the slow, inexorable diminishment of everything Eleanor had once taken for granted. Harriet had stayed when she might have sought employment elsewhere, had refused any discussion of wages, had declared with characteristic firmness that she would not abandon the child she had raised simply because fortune had turned its face away. Their funds would not last another 3 months, Eleanor knew, and she had received one offer of marriage from an elderly merchant named Mr. Crane, who had made clear he wanted a decorative young wife and domestic convenience, whose eyes had lingered on her figure while he spoke of household management and wifely duties. She had refused him, though she wondered now if pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "There was another offer once," Eleanor said, and her hand drifted to the hollow of her throat, 2 fingers pressing against the pulse that beat there, a gesture Harriet knew well. "Clarence Pemberton offered me pretty words and promises of devotion, and I believed everyone. 3 years ago, at the Hartwell Spring Ball, Eleanor had stood on the dance floor in a gown of pale blue silk, her father's fortune still intact, her future bright with possibility, and Clarence had approached her with that handsome face, those soft hands, that smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I find I must withdraw my offer of marriage, Miss Ashworth," he had announced, loudly enough for the surrounding couples to hear, his voice carrying over the music like a death knell. "Surely you understand. I cannot be expected to ally myself with a sinking ship, however pretty its figurehead." He had turned his back on her and walked away, leaving her standing alone as whispers erupted around her, as the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet, as everything she had believed about love and loyalty crumbled to ash. "Not all men are mercenary," Harriet said gently, but Eleanor shook her head, her fingers finding the gold locket that hung hidden beneath her bodice, the locket that held her mother's portrait, the only treasure she had left. "I will not hope," she said, and her voice was quiet but certain, the voice of a woman who had learned her lessons in the cruelest of schools. "Hope is the cruelest wound of all." The Duke of Ashworth's London townhouse stood in Mayfair like a monument to generations of wealth and power, its stone facade grey and imposing in the pale morning light, and within its walls Henry Blackwell sat in his study 2 days after the encounter in Hyde Park, unable to concentrate on the documents spread before him, his mind returning again and again to grey eyes swimming with tears, to a face of quiet dignity even in distress, to the way she had fled from him, as though his very presence was an intrusion upon her private grief. He told himself it was merely Thomas who kept the memory alive, for the boy had asked no fewer than 7 times since that afternoon whether the sad lady was feeling better now, whether someone had helped her, whether she had anyone to bring her tea and tell her stories when she was frightened, and each question had lodged itself beneath Henry's ribs like a splinter he could not remove. He rose from his desk and moved to the window looking out at the street below, where carriages passed and ladies walked with their maids, and he caught the faint scent of sandalwood from the soap he used, a scent that seemed to cling to everything in this room, to the leather of the chairs and the wood of the shelves and the very air he breathed. He was irritated with himself, deeply and thoroughly irritated, for he had learned long ago not to trust his judgment about women, not after Sophia, not after the beautiful lies she had told him with her beautiful mouth, not after he had believed every word and been made a fool before all of London. And yet something about this stranger's grief had felt genuine in a way Sophia's practised tears never had. Something in the resigned set of her shoulders, the way she had pressed her hand to her mouth as though ashamed of her own sorrow, the way she had apologized for weeping as though her pain was an imposition upon the world. He summoned his solicitor, Mr. Fletcher, and made inquiries that he told himself were merely practical, merely the due diligence any sensible man would undertake when a stranger had captured his son's attention. The information returned swiftly, for Fletcher was efficient and discreet. Miss Eleanor Ashworth, daughter of the late shipping merchant Jonathan Ashworth, once engaged to Lord Clarence Pemberton, Viscount Ridley, who had broken the engagement publicly when the Ashworth fortune collapsed, announcing on a ballroom floor that he could not be expected to ally himself with bankruptcy. Now living in reduced circumstances with a former governess as companion, her reputation spotless, her character known for intelligence and kindness, her situation desperate, though she bore it with dignity. Henry sat alone after Fletcher departed, a glass of brandy in his hands that he did not drink, the amber liquid catching the firelight as he turned the glass slowly, thinking of Thomas, who needed a mother's gentle influence, thinking of his own empty house and the succession that required an heir, thinking of the loneliness he refused to name, but that sat heavy in his chest on nights when the silence grew too loud. He thought of grey eyes that held sorrow but not self-pity, and before he could talk himself out of it, before his caution could reassert itself, he ran his hand through his hair in a gesture he did not notice, and took up his pen to write a letter that was formal and proper and utterly practical, a letter that was also, though he would not admit it even to himself, the first impulsive thing he had done in years. The letter arrived on a morning when the rain had finally ceased, and pale sunlight struggled through the clouds above London, and Eleanor stood in the cramped sitting-room of their lodgings with the paper trembling in her hands, reading the words once, twice, 3 times, certain that she had misunderstood, that this was some cruel jest designed to raise her hopes only to dash them more thoroughly than before. The Duke of Ashworth, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, the very gentleman who had witnessed her weeping in Hyde Park like a child, was offering her marriage. The letter was formal, almost cold in its precision, each word chosen with the care of a man who did not waste syllables on sentiment. He stated plainly that he required a wife for practical reasons, a mother for his son, a mistress for his household, a duchess to manage the social obligations his position demanded. He did not speak of affection. He did not speak of love. He offered her his name, his protection, and his word that she shall never be made to feel small again. He requested a meeting to discuss terms, if she was amenable. Eleanor's hands shook so violently that the paper rustled like dry leaves in autumn wind, and she sank into the worn chair by the cold hearth, her grey eyes fixed on those final words, as though they might rearrange themselves into something she could comprehend. Harriet read the letter with pursed lips and sharp eyes that missed nothing, and when she looked up her expression was cautiously optimistic in a way that made Eleanor's chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. "The Duke of Ashworth," Harriet said slowly, "is stern and private, rumoured to be cold since his first wife's death, but I have never heard him called cruel. His reputation is one of honour if not warmth. She urged Eleanor to at least meet with him, to hear his terms, to consider what such an arrangement might mean for their future. Eleanor resisted, her fingers drifting to the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat too quickly, afraid of hope, afraid of another humiliation, afraid of standing before a powerful man and being found wanting once more. But practicality won, as it always did in these desperate times. Their funds would not last another 3 months, and she had no other options, no other path forward, save the one that led to Mr. Crane and his assessing eyes. She agreed to the meeting. The tea-room was quiet and respectable, chosen for discretion, its patrons absorbed in their own conversations behind potted ferns and starched tablecloths. Henry arrived precisely on time, and Eleanor was struck by his physical presence in a way the brief encounter in the park had not allowed. Tall and broad-shouldered, dark-haired with silver at the temples, eyes so deep blue they appeared almost black in the afternoon light. He smelled of sandalwood and leather, with an undertone of something clean like winter air, and the scent wrapped around her like an unexpected comfort as he took the seat across from her. His voice was low and clipped as he explained his terms. A marriage of convenience, separate bedrooms, mutual respect, no pretense of romantic feeling. He watched her face as he spoke, and Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that he was waiting for her to refuse, to be offended, to demand the pretty lies that society expected. Instead, she met his eyes, those dark, unfathomable eyes that revealed nothing of the man beneath, and said quietly, "I accept your terms, Your Grace. I have learned the cost of pretty words. I would rather have honest ones." Something flickered in his gaze, surprise perhaps, or respect, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he nodded once. It was done. The wedding was small and private and efficient, exactly as Henry had arranged it, held in a quiet church in Mayfair, where the morning light filtered through stained glass windows and cast patterns of gold and blue across the worn stone floor, and Eleanor stood before the altar in a simple cream gown that Harriet had helped her choose, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant chignon that revealed the graceful column of her neck, her mother's locket hidden beneath the modest neckline where it pressed warm against her racing heart. There were no guests beyond Harriet and the required witnesses, no flowers save a small arrangement of white roses on the altar, no music save the distant sounds of London awakening beyond the church walls, and Eleanor told herself that this was precisely what she wanted, that she had no use for the elaborate ceremonies that belonged to brides who believed in love and happy endings and all the pretty lies she had long since learned to distrust. Henry stood beside her in dark, formal attire, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the window behind him, his face severe and unreadable as the vicar spoke the ancient words that would bind them together, and when he turned to face her and took her hand in his to slide the ring onto her finger, Eleanor was startled by the warmth of his touch, by the careful gentleness with which his large fingers handled hers, by the way his deep blue eyes held her gaze without wavering, as he spoke his vows in a low, steady voice that seemed to resonate in her very bones. The ring was a band of gold, set with a single sapphire that caught the light and glowed like a captured piece of summer sky, and as it settled onto her finger, Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had built beginning to tremble, though she would not let it fall. She spoke her own vows clearly, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Henry offered her his arm with formal precision and said simply, "Duchess," and the word sounded strange in his clipped voice, foreign and grand, and somehow terrifying in its finality. They were married, and she was safe, and she told herself firmly that this was enough, that safety was all she had ever truly wanted, that the flutter in her chest when his hand brushed hers was merely nerves and nothing more. The carriage ride to Blackwell Park took several hours through countryside that grew increasingly beautiful as London fell away behind them. Rolling hills and ancient forests and villages, with thatched roofs and church spires, reaching toward a sky that had cleared to pale spring blue, and Thomas sat with them in the carriage, bouncing with excitement as he chattered about his pony named Bramble and his nursery with its view of the lake and the gardens, where he was learning to identify every flower with the help of the head gardener, Mr. Shepherd. Henry answered his son's endless questions with a patience that surprised Eleanor, his voice softening almost imperceptibly when he spoke to the boy, his large hands gentle when he steadied Thomas against the swaying of the carriage, and Eleanor found herself watching him when she thought he would not notice, studying the way the silver at his temples caught the light, the way his jaw relaxed when Thomas made him almost smile, the way he looked out the window sometimes, as if seeing something beyond the passing countryside, something distant and unreachable and sad. He caught her watching once, their eyes meeting across the carriage, and neither looked away immediately, the moment stretching between them like a held breath, until Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks and turned hastily to the window, her heart beating too quickly, her fingers pressed to the hollow of her throat in the gesture she could not seem to break. Blackwell Park, when it finally came into view, took her breath away entirely, the estate spreading before them like something from a dream she had never dared to have. Rolling grounds of emerald green dotted with ancient oaks, whose branches reached toward the sky like supplicating arms, a grand house of honey-colored stone that glowed warm in the afternoon light, gardens stretching toward a distant lake that sparkled silver beneath the sun, and a conservatory whose glass walls glinted like diamonds against the darker green of the surrounding hedges. This was her home now, she realized with a shock that made her grip the edge of her seat, this vast and beautiful place where generations of Blackwells had lived and loved and died, where she would be mistress of more rooms than she could count, where servants whose names she did not yet know would look to her for guidance and direction. The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm her, to crush her beneath the weight of expectations she was not certain she could meet. And when the carriage finally stopped before the great front doors, and Henry descended first to hand her down, his grip on her elbow was steady and warm and somehow reassuring, his touch lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary before he released her and stepped back. Harriet, arriving in the second carriage with the luggage, observed this small exchange with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and later, when they were alone in the suite of rooms that would be Eleanor's private domain, she said quietly, "Mark my words, child, that man has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you. He may not know it yet, but he will." The gardens of Blackwell Park unfolded before Eleanor like a living tapestry 3 days after her arrival, and she walked the gravel paths with Thomas's small hand tucked trustingly in hers as he chattered about every bush and bloom they passed, pointing out the pond where he had once caught a frog, and the ancient oak whose lowest branch he was learning to climb with the help of the head gardener, Mr. Shepherd, who Thomas assured her was very patient and never scolded even when he slipped. Eleanor found herself charmed by the boy's openness, by the way he shared his small kingdom without reservation or guile, and she recognized in his eager face something of the child she herself had once been, before disappointment had taught her to guard her heart behind walls of quiet dignity and measured words. The morning had dawned grey and uncertain, clouds gathering on the horizon in a way that promised rain before evening, and the air held that peculiar heaviness that preceded storms, thick with the scent of damp earth and growing things. As they rounded a hedge of perfectly trimmed boxwood, Eleanor glanced toward the house and saw Henry standing at the library window, his tall figure dark against the glass, watching them with an expression she could not read from this distance. She pretended not to notice, keeping her attention fixed on Thomas as he tugged her toward a bed of roses, but she felt the weight of Henry's gaze like a physical touch, and her pulse quickened in a way she firmly refused to acknowledge. Thomas waved enthusiastically at his father, his whole arm swinging with the abandon of childhood, and though Henry did not wave back, Eleanor noticed that he did not turn away either, his silhouette remaining at the window until they passed beyond the hedge and out of sight. When Thomas was called inside for his lessons by his governess, Miss Clara Beckett, Eleanor continued walking alone. Drawn by some instinct, she did not examine toward the conservatory she had glimpsed from the carriage on her first day. Through the glass walls, she could see flowers in brilliant colours, hothouse blooms that defied the grey English weather, and among them, rising like pale stars against the green, a profusion of white camellias in full and glorious bloom. Eleanor stopped on the path, her breath catching in her throat, her hand rising unbidden to press against her chest, where her mother's locket lay hidden beneath her bodice. White camellias had been her mother's favourite flower, and they had become Eleanor's own, a secret devotion she rarely spoke of because the memory was too precious, too tender to share with those who might not understand. She had not seen so many since childhood, since the conservatory of her father's house before everything had been lost, and the sight of them now, unexpected and abundant, made her eyes sting with tears she would not shed. "White camellias," she murmured softly, almost to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "How beautiful!" She did not know that Henry had left the library window and crossed the lawn with silent purpose, that he stood now only a few feet behind her, close enough to hear her whispered words, close enough to see the way her fingers trembled against her bodice. The path near the conservatory was slicked with rain from the previous night, the stones dark and gleaming where water still pooled in the crevices, and Eleanor, distracted by the flowers and the memories they stirred, did not watch her footing as carefully as she should have. Her boot slipped on a wet stone, and she stumbled forward with a small gasp of alarm, certain she would fall, already bracing for the impact of gravel against her palms. But before she could fall, a strong hand caught her elbow, the grip firm and warm even through the fabric of her spencer, steadying her with an ease that spoke of considerable strength, held carefully in check. Henry. She had not heard him approach, had not sensed his presence until his hand was on her arm and his scent surrounded her, sandalwood and leather with that undertone of something clean like winter air that she remembered from the tea-room, from the church, from every moment he had stood close enough for her to breathe him in. "Careful, Duchess," he said, his voice low and clipped, but there was something beneath the formality, something that made her skin warm where his fingers pressed. Their eyes met, grey to deep blue, and Eleanor became acutely aware of everything at once, the strength of his hand on her arm, the breadth of his shoulders blocking the grey sky behind him, the way his dark hair was slightly disordered, as though he had walked quickly across the lawn, the muscle that flexed in his jaw as he looked down at her with an intensity that stole her breath more thoroughly than her near fall had done. He released her a fraction too slowly, his fingers sliding from her elbow with a reluctance that might have been her imagination, but felt devastatingly real. And Eleanor stood very still, feeling the ghost of his touch linger on her arm like a brand. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect. He nodded once, curtly, and stepped back to a proper distance. But she saw him flex his hand at his side, opening and closing his fingers, as if trying to retain the sensation of touching her, and something shifted in the air between them, something neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both of them felt, a current of awareness that had not been there before, or perhaps had been there all along, waiting only for the right moment to make itself known. The nursery wing lay at the eastern end of the house, where the morning light would fall first through tall windows, and Eleanor found herself there 5 days after her arrival, not by intention, but by the wandering curiosity that had become her habit in the quiet hours after dinner, when the great house seemed to breathe around her like a living thing. and she had meant only to explore the gallery of family portraits she had glimpsed earlier that day. But sound of voices drew her down an unfamiliar corridor until she stood before a door left partially ajar, candlelight spilling through the gap in a warm golden ribbon across the polished floor. She knew she should not eavesdrop, knew that whatever passed between father and son in this private hour was not meant for her ears. And yet something held her motionless, some instinct that whispered she was about to witness something important, something that would change the careful architecture of distance she had built around her heart. Through the narrow opening she could see Henry kneeling beside Thomas's small bed, his broad shoulders curved inward as he brought himself to his son's level, and the severity that marked his features in daylight had softened in the candlelight until he looked almost gentle, almost tender, almost like a different man entirely, from the one who spoke to her in clipped formal phrases and watched her with those unreadable dark eyes. Thomas was tucked beneath a quilted coverlet embroidered with tiny ships, his dark hair tousled against the white pillow, and he was asking his father for a story. "Please, Papa," the one about the brave knight. And Henry's voice when he answered was low and rough, with an affection that made Eleanor's throat tighten. "Once there was a knight," Henry began, one large hand reaching out to brush a lock of hair from Thomas's forehead with impossible gentleness, "who was afraid of the dark, though he told no one of his fear, for he believed that knights must never be afraid." Thomas's eyes were wide and fixed on his father's face with perfect trust, and Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth to keep silent as Henry continued, his deep voice weaving the tale of a knight who learned that darkness was not his enemy, that fear was not his weakness, that courage was not the absence of terror, but the choice to act despite it. "Even the bravest knights feel fear," Henry said quietly, and something in his voice suggested he was no longer speaking only of the story. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Thomas. It is choosing to act despite it." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his small face thoughtful, and then he asked in that direct way children have, "Papa, were you ever afraid?" Henry's hand stilled on the coverlet, and Eleanor saw his jaw tighten in the way she had come to recognize, the way that meant he was suppressing something too large to speak. "Every day," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "when you were small and your mother was gone, I was afraid I would fail you." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that spilled hot down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she pressed harder against her mouth, her chest aching with something she could not name, something vast and tender and terrifying. This was not the cold duke that society whispered about, not the stern and distant husband who had offered her a practical arrangement devoid of feeling. This was a man who loved his child with a depth that stole her breath, who admitted to fear and failure with an honesty that shattered every assumption she had made about him. She retreated silently before either could discover her presence, her slippered feet making no sound on the carpet as she fled to her own sitting room where the fire burned low and her book lay abandoned on the chair where she had left it hours ago. She sat before the flames but did not see them, her mind filled instead with the image of Henry kneeling beside his son, his voice gentle, his hand tender, his heart so clearly capable of love that she wondered how she had ever believed him cold. She thought of Clarence, who had spoken of love in flowery phrases, while his eyes calculated her worth in pounds and properties, and she thought of Henry, who had never spoken a tender word to her, and yet had shown her more genuine care in small gestures than Clarence had shown in 2 years of courtship. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat too quickly beneath her palm, and she recognized the signs with a terror that matched anything Henry's story knight had faced. She was in danger. She was beginning to feel. Harriet entered some time later and found Eleanor staring into the dying fire, her grey eyes silver with unshed tears, and her expression troubled in a way that made the older woman set aside her embroidery and take the chair beside her. "What has happened, child?" Harriet asked, and Eleanor, unable to keep the secret, told her what she had witnessed, her voice soft and halting as she described Henry's gentleness with Thomas, his admission of fear, the way his whole demeanour had transformed in the candlelight of the nursery. Harriet listened without interruption, her sharp eyes seeing far more than Eleanor's words revealed, and when the tale was finished she said gently, "A man who loves his child so tenderly is capable of great love, Eleanor. Perhaps he has simply forgotten how to show it to anyone else." Eleanor shook her head, her hand drifting to the hollow of her throat in the gesture she could not seem to break. "I cannot afford to hope, Harriet. We agreed to a practical arrangement. He does not want my heart." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they rang hollow, knew that her heart was already slipping beyond her control, already turning toward a man who knelt beside his son's bed and spoke of courage and fear with an honesty that undid her completely. Harriet said nothing, but her expression was knowing, and outside the window the wind had risen again, promising storms to come. Dinner was a formal affair 1 week after Eleanor's arrival at Blackwell Park, as it had been each evening since she had taken her place at the foot of the long mahogany table with Henry at its head, and Thomas seated between them like a small bridge spanning the vast distance of polished wood and silver candlesticks and careful silence. And Harriet sat in her customary chair near Eleanor, her presence a comfort, even as the conversation remained stilted and proper, each exchange measured and weighed as though words were currency too precious to spend freely. Henry inquired about Eleanor's day with the same formal courtesy he might extend to a visiting dignitary, and she responded with careful pleasantries about the gardens and her correspondence and the book she had been reading, all the while acutely aware of the chasm between them that seemed to widen with every polite phrase. And she wondered if this was how all their evenings would unfold. Two strangers bound by law and circumstance, sharing a table but nothing more. Their silences filled not with companionship, but with the careful avoidance of anything that might crack the veneer of propriety they had constructed around themselves. Thomas fidgeted in his chair, clearly bored by the adult restraint that governed the meal, his small legs swinging beneath the table as he pushed his food around his plate with the restless energy of a child who longed to be anywhere but trapped in formal dining. And Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for him, remembering her own childhood dinners, where laughter had been as common as bread, and her father's voice had filled the room with warmth and stories. It happened so quickly that afterward Eleanor could never quite piece together the precise sequence of events. Thomas, attempting to cut his meat with more enthusiasm than skill, somehow launched a piece of potato from his plate with the force of a small catapult, and the morsel sailed across the table in a graceful arc that seemed to hang suspended in the candlelight before landing, with perfect and devastating accuracy, directly upon the tip of Henry's nose. There was a moment of frozen horror in which time itself seemed to stop, Thomas's eyes going wide with terror at what he had done, Eleanor's hand flying to her mouth in shock, even Harriet stiffening in her chair, as though bracing for the storm that must surely follow. And Henry's expression was utterly unreadable, his dark blue eyes fixed on some middle distance as the potato balanced absurdly on his aristocratic nose. Then Thomas, unable to contain himself despite his fear, let out a small giggle that he immediately tried to swallow. And something broke loose inside Eleanor, something that had been locked away for years behind walls of dignity and sorrow, and the careful control she had learned was necessary for survival, and she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and musical, and utterly beyond her power to stop, the sound spilling from her like water from a broken dam, and she pressed her hand harder against her mouth, but it did nothing to stem the tide of mirth that shook her shoulders and brought tears to her eyes. Henry stared at her across the length of the table, the potato still perched ridiculously on his nose, and something extraordinary happened. The corner of his mouth curved upward, just slightly, just enough to transform his severe features into something almost boyish, almost warm. And his eyes, when they met hers, were not the deep black of his guarded moments, but the clear summer blue she had glimpsed only in rare and precious instances. He removed the potato from his nose with immense dignity, setting it carefully on the edge of his plate as though it were a matter of no consequence whatsoever. But his eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's laughing face with an intensity that made her breath catch even through her mirth. And she saw in his expression something she had never seen directed at her before, something that looked almost like wonder. After dinner, they retired to the drawing-room, where the fire crackled warmly against the rising wind outside, and Thomas was permitted to stay up late as a reward for providing such memorable entertainment. Settling himself on the carpet near the hearth with his collection of toy soldiers, while Eleanor and Henry took chairs that were, she noticed, closer together than they had ever sat before, close enough that she could smell the familiar sandalwood and leather of him, close enough that if she reached out her hand, she might almost touch his sleeve. Harriet observed from across the room with her embroidery forgotten in her lap, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the changed atmosphere between husband and wife, and Eleanor felt the weight of that knowing gaze, but could not bring herself to care, not when Henry turned to her and said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, "You have a lovely laugh, Duchess. I had not heard it before." The warmth that bloomed in Eleanor's chest at his words was almost painful in its intensity, and she found herself tilting her head slightly to the right as she answered, her grey eyes warming to silver in the firelight. "I had not had occasion to use it, Your Grace." Their eyes met and held, and something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but understood, an acknowledgment that the careful distance they had maintained was beginning to crumble, that the practical arrangement they had agreed upon was transforming into something neither of them had anticipated. Thomas made battle sounds with his soldiers, oblivious to the shift occurring above his head, and outside the wind rose higher, promising rain before morning, but Eleanor barely noticed, too consumed by the warmth in Henry's summer-sky eyes and the almost smile that still lingered at the corner of his mouth, a smile that seemed meant for her alone. The days at Blackwell Park folded one into another, like the pages of a book Eleanor found herself reluctant to close, and she settled into her role as Duchess with an ease that surprised her, moving through the great house with growing confidence as the household staff, initially watchful and reserved, began to warm to her quiet competence and genuine interest in their lives and labours, and she learned their names one by one, committing each to memory, along with the small details they shared. The housekeeper, Mrs. Morton's daughter, who was expecting her first child, the footman, James, whose mother was ill in the village, the cook, Mrs. Henley, whose receipt for apple tart had won prizes at the harvest fair for 3 years running, and Eleanor found that remembering these things cost her nothing, but brought such visible pleasure to those she spoke with that she wondered why anyone would choose to do otherwise. And she did not know that Mrs. Morton had confided to Harriet one afternoon over tea in the housekeeper's sitting-room that the new Duchess was nothing like the last one, that one never learned a single servant's name in all her years here, treated us like furniture, she did. But her Grace, she sees us. She truly sees us. And Harriet had smiled and said nothing, but felt a fierce pride in the girl she had raised from childhood. The small moments accumulated like snowfall, each one slight in itself, but together forming something substantial and undeniable. And Eleanor began to notice that Henry appeared at breakfast each morning now, though she had learned from Mrs. Morton that he had previously taken that meal alone in his study for years, and he would look up from his correspondence when she entered and nod in greeting, and sometimes he would ask her opinion on matters of the estate, tenant disputes that required delicacy, charitable donations to the village church and school, improvements to the cottages that housed the families who worked his lands, and he listened to her answers with genuine attention, his dark blue eyes fixed on her face as she spoke, and she found herself thinking more carefully about her responses, because he seemed to value them, seemed to weigh them as worthy of consideration, and this was a gift she had not known she craved until it was given. One morning she mentioned in passing, almost without thinking, that she found the morning room rather chilly despite the fire, and she thought nothing more of it until that afternoon, when she entered to find that a new fire screen had been installed, positioned to better direct the warmth toward the chair she favoured, and the chair itself had been replaced with one upholstered in deep blue velvet, softer and more comfortable than its predecessor, and Henry said nothing about it when she saw him at dinner, did not even glance at her when she sat in her usual place at the foot of the table, but she touched the soft velvet of her new chair and felt her heart turn over in her chest with something that felt dangerously like tenderness. She spent an afternoon in the library some days later, losing herself in the poetry she had always loved, and she found a volume of Wordsworth bound in worn leather that fell open naturally to a familiar poem, and she read aloud softly, thinking herself entirely alone in the quiet room with its smell of old books and beeswax, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke the words she had loved since girlhood. A perfect woman, nobly planned, to warn, to comfort and command. And she did not know that Henry had paused outside the door on his way to his study, that he stood motionless in the corridor, with his hand gripping the doorframe until his knuckles whitened, his eyes closed as he listened to her voice give life to verses that seemed to describe everything he had not known he was seeking. And when she finished and silence fell, he slipped away before she could discover him. But later that evening, when she returned to the library, she found the book had been moved to a small table beside her favorite chair, a silk ribbon marking the page she had been reading, and she told herself it meant nothing, that a servant must have tidied it, that she was foolish to imagine otherwise. But that night she dreamed of blue eyes warming to the colour of summer sky, and she woke with her hand pressed to her racing heart, and the certain knowledge that she was losing a battle she had never intended to fight. The storm announced itself long before it arrived, the afternoon sky darkening to the colour of bruised plums as clouds gathered above Blackwell Park with the weight of something inevitable. And by the time evening fell, the wind had risen to a howl that rattled the windows in their frames and sent the servants scurrying to secure shutters and check the fires, and Eleanor found herself restless in a way she could not name, pacing her sitting room, while Harriet watched with knowing eyes, until finally she declared she would seek a book from the library to settle her mind, though in truth she did not know what she sought, only that the storm outside seemed to echo something turbulent within her own chest. The library was not empty when she arrived, though she had expected it to be at this late hour, and she paused in the doorway when she saw Henry standing at the tall windows with his back to the room, his figure silhouetted against the flash of lightning that split the sky, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, something in the stillness of his posture, that made her hesitate on the threshold, as though she had stumbled upon a private grief. A glass of brandy sat untouched on the table beside his usual chair, amber liquid catching the firelight, and he did not turn when she entered, though she knew he was aware of her presence, knew it in the way his spine straightened almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke his voice was rough in a way she had never heard it, stripped of its usual clipped formality. "Storms kept Sophia awake," he said, and the name hung in the air between them like smoke, the first time he had spoken of his first wife directly to Eleanor, and she remained still in the doorway, scarcely breathing, sensing that something important was unfolding in this storm-dark room. She hated them, said they made her feel trapped, and I would sit with her through the night while she wept and raged, believing myself a devoted husband, believing that my presence brought her comfort, laughed a sound utterly without humour, and lightning flashed again, illuminating the hard line of his jaw. "I was a fool, Duchess, the greatest fool in England, and I did not even know it." Eleanor moved into the room slowly, drawn by his pain despite her better judgment, and she lowered herself into the chair beside his, close enough that she could smell the familiar sandalwood and leather of him, close enough that if she reached out she might touch his sleeve. But she did not reach out, only waited as the storm raged beyond the windows, and Henry stood motionless before the glass. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, halting and rough as though each word cost him something precious, and he told her of Sophia, of her beauty and charm that had dazzled London society, of his certainty that he had found a love to last a lifetime, and then of the slow, terrible discovery that she had wanted only his title and his fortune, that she had taken lovers openly and flaunted her affairs before the very servants who attended them, that she had laughed at his pain when he confronted her and told him he was naive to expect fidelity from a woman who had married for position. "When she died," he said, and his hands gripped the armrest of the chair he had finally lowered himself into, knuckles white with the force of his grip. "When the carriage overturned on the road to Dover, where she was fleeing with her latest paramour, I felt not grief, but relief, and then such shame for feeling relief that I thought it might destroy me." He did not look at Eleanor as he spoke, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, and she watched the muscle flex near his ear as he fought for composure. "I failed to see her true nature. I trusted my judgment, and I was wrong. I have not trusted it since." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of rain lashing the windows and thunder rolling across the sky, and Eleanor sat very still, her heart aching with a tenderness she had not known she possessed, and when she spoke her voice was quiet but steady. "You were not wrong to love, Your Grace. You were wrong to love someone who could not love in return, and that is not a failure of your judgment, but a failure of her character, not yours." Henry turned to look at her then, and in the flash of lightning that illuminated the library, his eyes were not the deep black of his guarded moments, but the aching blue of summer sky, and something passed between them in that charged silence, something that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "You are kind, Duchess," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could not quite suppress. "Kinder than I deserve." Eleanor shook her head, her grey eyes silver in the firelight. "You deserve kindness, Your Grace, perhaps more than you know." They sat together as the storm raged on, not touching, not speaking, but the silence between them was not empty. It was full of understanding, of shared wounds, of something growing in the space between two guarded hearts that neither of them dared to name. The month at Blackwell Park had passed like a dream, from which Eleanor was reluctant to wake, each day unfolding with a quiet contentment she had not known since childhood, and though she would not permit herself to name the feeling that had taken root in her chest, she recognized its shape in the way she found herself listening for Henry's footsteps in the corridor, in the way her heart lifted when he appeared at breakfast each morning, with his dark hair still damp from washing, and his deep blue eyes seeking hers across the table before he remembered to guard his expression, and she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of their days together, the walks in the gardens where Thomas ran ahead, and she and Henry followed at a slower pace with their shoulders nearly touching, the evenings in the library where the fire crackled, and he read his reports, while she read poetry, and their silences were no longer awkward but companionable, filled with something unspoken that hummed between them like a plucked string. Thomas had begun calling her Mamma without prompting or correction, the word slipping from his lips as naturally as breathing, and each time he said it, Eleanor felt her heart swell painfully with a love she had not expected to feel for this bright-eyed boy who had his father's observant nature, but had not yet learned to hide his tender heart. And she would catch Henry watching, when Thomas climbed into her lap for a story, or reached for her hand during their walks, his expression unreadable, but his eyes that deep summer sky blue that she had come to recognize as something other than coldness. But now London called with its glittering ballrooms and poisonous whispers, and the letter had arrived 3 days ago announcing that the season was beginning and the Duke of Ashworth must present his new Duchess to society. And Eleanor had felt the familiar dread settle into her bones like winter cold, a physical weight in her chest that made it difficult to breathe when she thought of facing the ton that had witnessed her humiliation 3 years ago. She confided her fears to Harriet on the morning of their departure. Standing in her sitting room with her travelling dress half buttoned and her hands trembling as she spoke of Clarence Pemberton and his cruel smile, of the whispers that would follow her through every ballroom, of the possibility that she might encounter him and his wife and be forced to pretend that his betrayal had not shattered something essential within her. And Harriet had taken her hands firmly and reminded her that she was no longer the desperate, dowryless girl Clarence had discarded, but the Duchess of Ashworth, with a husband who was powerful and respected. But Eleanor knew that titles could not armour the heart against old wounds. In the carriage to London, with the countryside giving way to crowded streets and the familiar grey sprawl of the city, Henry noticed her pallor and the way she twisted her gloved hands in her lap, and though he did not ask directly because that was not his way, he said quietly without looking at her, "You will not face society alone, Duchess. I will be beside you." And the words were not a declaration of affection, but something perhaps more valuable, a promise of protection spoken in his low-clipped voice. And Eleanor looked at his severe profile, and his strong hands resting on his thighs, and the silver at his temples that caught the light through the carriage window. And she felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of fear that had been tightening since the letter arrived. And she said softly, "Thank you, Your Grace." And he nodded once curtly, but she saw his jaw soften almost imperceptibly, saw the muscle near his ear relax, and she understood that she was not alone, that perhaps she had not been alone since the day he caught her elbow on the rain-slicked path and held on a fraction too long. And as London rose around them with its smoke and noise and memories, Eleanor touched the hollow of her throat where her mother's locket lay hidden, and reminded herself of the courage Henry had spoken of to Thomas, the courage that was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The ballroom of the Wellington estate blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, chandeliers dripping crystal fire above the assembled cream of London society, and Eleanor entered on Henry's arm with her spine straight and her chin level and her heart pounding so violently against her ribs that she was certain he must feel it through the layers of silk and kid leather that separated his arm from her trembling fingers, and she was acutely aware of every eye that turned toward them as they crossed the threshold. Every fan that lifted to shield whispered words, every glance that raked over her gown of pale blue silk, and the sapphires at her throat that Henry had presented to her that afternoon without comment, simply leaving the velvet case on her dressing table as though such magnificence were nothing remarkable. And the whispers began immediately like wind through dry leaves. The new Duchess, the girl Pemberton discarded, risen from disgrace to the highest title in the land, and Eleanor kept her expression serene through sheer force of will, even as her stomach churned, and her free hand longed to rise to the hollow of her throat in that nervous gesture she had never quite conquered. Henry was a wall of dark-clad strength beside her, his presence commanding respect even from those whose eyes gleamed with malice, and she drew courage from the solid warmth of his arm beneath her fingers, from the faint scent of sandalwood and leather that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. And when he glanced down at her with those deep blue eyes, she saw something in them that might have been concern, might have been encouragement, and she lifted her chin a fraction higher and allowed him to lead her into the glittering fray. They navigated an hour of introductions and congratulations, of curtsies and bows and murmured pleasantries, and Eleanor performed her role with the quiet dignity that had always been her armour, accepting compliments on her gown and her jewels and her remarkable fortune with gracious murmurs, while society matrons assessed her worth, and young debutantes eyed her position with barely concealed envy, and through it all Henry remained at her side, his hand covering hers on his arm, his presence a silent declaration that she was under his protection, and Eleanor began to believe that perhaps she might survive this evening after all. Then she saw him, and the fragile peace she had constructed shattered like glass beneath a careless heel. For Clarence Pemberton was approaching through the crowd with his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight, and his handsome features arranged in an expression of exaggerated courtesy that did not reach his pale blue eyes, and behind him trailed Lady Augusta with her sour expression and her magnificent diamonds and her obvious dissatisfaction with everything around her. And Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice in her veins as 3 years of carefully buried humiliation rose up to choke her. Clarence bowed with elaborate formality, his soft manicured hands making elegant gestures that seemed to mock the very notion of respect. And he addressed Henry first, with the deference owed to a duke, before turning to Eleanor with a smile that curved like a blade, and when he spoke his voice carried just far enough for the surrounding guests to hear, as it had carried that terrible night at the Hartwell Spring Ball, when he had destroyed her before all of London. "Your Grace," he said to her, making the title sound like an insult, "how unexpected to find you risen so high. I confess I never imagined such a transformation possible for Miss Ashworth. Or should I say the Duchess now? Tell me, does the Duke know he married damaged goods, a woman whose own father's debts—" But he did not finish the sentence, for Henry stepped forward with a movement so swift and controlled that it seemed almost leisurely, placing himself between Clarence and Eleanor like a shield of flesh and bone and barely contained fury. And when he spoke, his voice was low and controlled and utterly deadly, carrying with the precision of a man who intended every word to be heard and remembered. "Lord Pemberton, I gave my word that my wife would never be made to feel small again. I intend to keep it." The words fell into a spreading silence, as nearby conversations died and fans stilled, and every ear strained to catch what the cold Duke would say next. And Henry continued, in that same terrible measured tone, "You discarded a woman of intelligence and dignity and worth, because you lacked the character to see beyond a balance sheet. That failure was yours, not hers, and now you stand before me in my presence insulting the Duchess of Ashworth." His eyes were black ice, his jaw set like granite, and Eleanor watched Clarence's face drain of colour as the full weight of the Duke's displeasure settled upon him like a physical blow. "You are not welcome in any house where I am received. You are not welcome to speak to my wife, or to look at my wife, or to speak her name. If I hear that you have done so, I will ensure that every door in England closes to you. Do I make myself clear?" Clarence stammered something that might have been an apology or a protest, his handsome face ugly now with fear and resentment, and he bowed jerkily and retreated through the crowd that parted before him like water before a sinking stone. And Lady Augusta followed with her diamonds flashing, and her expression twisted with something that might have been bitter envy or might have been reluctant respect, as she cast one last glance at Eleanor over her shoulder. The whispers that rose in their wake were of a different tenor now, awed and speculative. The Duke defended his Duchess, the Duke loves his wife, and Eleanor stood frozen with tears pricking her eyes and her heart so full she thought it might burst from her chest. And when Henry turned back to her, his expression had softened almost imperceptibly, the ice in his eyes thawing to that summer sky blue she had come to treasure, and he offered her his hand with a formality that could not quite hide the tenderness beneath. "Shall we dance, Duchess?" he asked, as though nothing of consequence had occurred, as though he had not just destroyed a man's social standing to defend her honour, and Eleanor placed her trembling hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor where the orchestra was beginning a waltz, and as his arm came around her waist and his hand engulfed hers, and they began to move together through the candle-lit splendor of the ballroom, she allowed herself for the first time to believe that she might matter to him, that the practical arrangement they had made might have become something far more precious. And when she looked up into his face and found him watching her with an intensity that stole her breath, she knew with sudden devastating certainty that she was no longer in danger of falling in love with her husband, for she had already fallen, completely and irrevocably, and there was no climbing back. The carriage ride back to the London townhouse passed in a blur of lamplight and shadow, and Eleanor sat beside Henry in a silence that hummed with everything unspoken, her heart still racing from the dance they had shared, from the way his hand had rested at the small of her back as he guided her through the waltz, from the warmth in his eyes when he looked down at her that was nothing like the cold Duke society whispered about. And when they arrived, and he handed her down from the carriage, his fingers lingered on hers for a breath longer than propriety demanded, and she felt the ghost of his touch all the way up the stairs to her private sitting room, where Harriet was waiting with tea and sharp, knowing eyes. Eleanor sank into the chair by the fire, still wearing her pale blue silk and the sapphires that felt warm against her throat, and she pressed her hand to her chest where her heart refused to slow its frantic beating. And Harriet watched her for a long moment before setting down her embroidery and saying in that practical voice that had guided Eleanor through every trial of her life, "A man who defends you before the world, child, has already declared himself. The words are merely formality." And Eleanor shook her head, even as tears pricked her eyes, because she wanted so desperately to believe it, and yet could not quite allow herself to hope, not when hope had wounded her so deeply before, not when she had sworn to herself that she would accept security and companionship and expect nothing more. But the memory of Henry's voice, low and deadly as he destroyed Clarence Pemberton with nothing but words and the weight of his displeasure, would not leave her, nor would the image of his face when he turned back to her and offered his hand to dance, as though he had not just upended her entire understanding of their arrangement. And she touched the hollow of her throat where her mother's locket lay hidden beneath the sapphires, and whispered, "He made me a promise, Harriet. He said I would never be made to feel small again, and he kept it. But that does not mean—" She could not finish the sentence because she did not know what it did not mean, did not know anything any more except that her heart had betrayed her completely, and she was in love with her husband, wholly and irrevocably, and the knowledge was both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. A soft knock came at the door, and Eleanor's breath caught as Henry's voice, low and rough in a way she had never heard it, said through the wood, "I wanted to ensure you were well, Duchess. The evening was eventful." And she rose on trembling legs and crossed to the door and opened it to find him standing in the hallway with his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly dishevelled, as though he had run his hand through it, that gesture she had come to recognize as suppressed emotion, and his deep blue eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "I am well, Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks to you." And something flickered in his expression, something that looked almost like longing before he shuttered it away, and he nodded once and said, "Sleep well, Eleanor," using her Christian name for the first time since their wedding, and the sound of it on his lips was sweeter than any endearment Clarence had ever offered. And then he was gone, his footsteps retreating down the corridor, and Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it with her hand pressed to her racing heart, while Harriet smiled quietly into her embroidery and said nothing at all. The days following the Wellington ball passed in a strange, suspended state for Eleanor, each hour weighted with significance she could not quite name, and she found herself watching Henry with new eyes as they moved through the rituals of the London season together, attending dinners and musicales and afternoon calls where society observed them with barely concealed fascination, the whispers now tinged with something that sounded almost like admiration, for the tale of the Duke's defence of his Duchess had spread through drawing-rooms and clubs like wildfire, embellished with each retelling until Henry had become a romantic hero, and Eleanor a vindicated heroine, and she did not know whether to be grateful or terrified by the way the ton now looked at them, as though their marriage were a love match, rather than the practical arrangement it had been, though she was no longer certain what it was becoming, no longer certain of anything except that her heart raced when Henry entered a room, and her skin remembered the warmth of his hand at her back during their waltz, and her dreams were filled with deep blue eyes that warmed to summer sky. She tried to maintain the careful distance that had defined their early interactions, tried to remind herself that he had offered her protection and respect, but never affection, that the vow he had kept so magnificently at the ball was a matter of honour rather than love. But her resolve crumbled a little more each day as she noticed the small attentions he paid her, the way he appeared at her side before she could feel lost at crowded gatherings, the way his voice dropped to that low, rough register when he spoke to her alone, the way his eyes followed her across rooms when he thought she was not watching, and she remembered Harriet's words about a man who defends you before the world, having already declared himself, and she wanted desperately to believe them, even as she feared the wanting. One afternoon, returning to the townhouse after a particularly tedious call on a society matron who had clearly invited her only to gather gossip, Eleanor passed the open door of Henry's study and heard voices within. Henry's low rumble and another voice she did not recognize, a man speaking of investments and shipping concerns, and she would have continued past without pausing, except that she heard her father's name, Jonathan Ashworth, spoken with a respect that made her freeze in the hallway, with her hand pressed to the wall for balance. She heard the stranger say that the Ashworth shipping routes had been sound, that the losses were due to storms and ill fortune rather than poor judgment, that any investor would have been proud to partner with such a man, and she heard Henry respond that he had suspected as much, that he had made inquiries because he wished to understand, and Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she realized what he had done, that he had investigated her father's business not to confirm her shame, but to understand her history, to know her, and the knowledge was almost too much to bear. She retreated before she could be discovered, her heart pounding against her ribs, and when she reached her sitting-room, she stood at the window looking out at the grey London sky, and allowed herself for one terrifying moment to hope, to truly hope, that Henry Blackwell might be capable of loving her as she had come to love him. The unexpected encounter came 3 days after Eleanor had overheard the conversation about her father, and she was still carrying the warmth of that discovery close to her heart, like a secret talisman, when she found herself face to face with Lady Augusta Pemberton in the withdrawing-room of Lady Hartwell's afternoon musicale, a gathering Eleanor had attended only because Henry had been called away on urgent business, and she had promised to represent them both. And now she stood frozen as Clarence's wife approached her, with an expression that was neither the sneer Eleanor had expected, nor the bitter envy she had witnessed at the Wellington ball, but something altogether more complicated, something that looked almost like weary recognition. Lady Augusta was beautiful in the cold, polished way of a marble statue, her golden hair perfectly arranged, her gown impeccable, her jewels worth more than Eleanor's father had earned in his best year, and yet there was a tightness around her eyes, a brittleness to her composure, that spoke of unhappiness worn like a second skin, and when she spoke her voice was low enough that the other ladies clustered near the pianoforte could not hear. "Your Grace," Lady Augusta said, and the title held no mockery, only a kind of tired acknowledgment. "I find I must speak with you, though I confess I do not know quite what I wish to say. Perhaps only that I have watched you these past weeks, watched the way your husband looks at you when he thinks no one is observing, watched the way you have risen from the ashes of the disgrace my husband visited upon you, and I find myself thinking thoughts I never expected to think." Eleanor's hand drifted to the hollow of her throat, that familiar gesture of uncertainty, but she did not retreat.
did not look away from the sharp intelligence in Lady Augusta's pale eyes, and after a moment she said quietly, "What thoughts are those, Lady Pemberton?" The other woman's laugh was soft and bitter as winter wind. "That you escaped him, your Grace, that whatever pain he caused you that night 3 years ago, it was a mercy. Compared to the alternative, I was not so fortunate, though I thought myself so clever at the time, so triumphant when I secured his proposal and his title and his handsome face. I did not understand then that a man who values only gold will never see the woman who wears it, will never offer anything but the cold comfort of purchased things." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of old anger, old hurt, as she looked at this woman who had everything Eleanor had once envied, and nothing.
Eleanor now possessed no warmth, no tenderness, no husband who remembered small details and acted on them without acknowledgment, no husband who defended her before the world and called her by her Christian name in the quiet of the hallway, and she found herself reaching out to touch Lady Augusta's gloved hand with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I am sorry," Eleanor said, and meant it. "I am sorry for us both, for what he took from each of us in different ways." And Lady Augusta's eyes glistened for just a moment before she blinked the moisture away, and straightened her spine, and became once again the cold, polished wife of Viscount Ridley. But something had passed between them, an understanding, a shared recognition of wounds that had shaped them differently, but come from the same source. And when Eleanor returned to the townhouse that evening, she found Henry waiting for her in the drawing-room, his dark eyes searching her face with that intensity that still made her pulse stutter, and she told him of the encounter, of the strange, sad connection she had forged with the woman who had married the man who had destroyed her. And Henry listened in silence, his jaw tight with that muscle flexing near his ear that she had learned to recognize. And when she finished, he said only, "You have a generous heart, Eleanor, more generous than most would be in your place." And the way he said her name, low and rough with something that sounded almost like wonder, made her breath catch and her grey eyes warm to silver with the hope she could no longer deny. The storm that had been threatening all day broke over London that evening with a fury that rattled the windows of the townhouse and sent servants scurrying to check the shutters. And Eleanor sat alone in the library where she had retreated after dinner, a volume of poetry open in her lap, though she had not turned a page in nearly an hour. Her thoughts too full of Henry to leave room for Wordsworth, too full of the way he had said her name the night before, the way his voice had dropped to that rough, tender register that she had come to recognize as something he reserved for her alone. And she was so lost in her reverie that she did not hear the door open, did not sense his presence until the scent of sandalwood and leather reached her, and she looked up to find him standing just inside the threshold, his dark hair disrupted as though he had run his hand through it. That gesture she had learned meant he was feeling something he could not easily express, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with everything that remained unspoken, while lightning illuminated the library in brilliant flashes, and thunder rolled across the sky like a herald, announcing something momentous. "I did not mean to disturb you," Henry said, his voice low, but he did not move to leave. And Eleanor found herself rising from her chair, the book sliding forgotten to the cushion, her heart beating so violently she was certain he must hear it even above the storm. "You are not disturbing me," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected, though her hand drifted to the hollow of her throat in that unconscious gesture of uncertainty, and she saw his eyes follow the movement, saw something flicker in their depths that made her breath catch. He crossed the room toward her with the deliberate stride of a man who had made a decision, and when he stopped before her, he was close enough that she could see the silver threads at his temples, close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the space between them, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion. She had never heard from him before. "I find I cannot continue as we have been," he said, and Eleanor's heart plummeted even as it raced, certain he meant to send her away, certain that she had imagined everything. But then he continued, his words halting as though each one cost him something precious. "I find that the arrangement we made is no longer sufficient, that I have come to want things I swore I would never want again, that I have come to feel things I believed myself incapable of feeling, and I do not know how to speak of such things, Eleanor. I have never known how to speak of them, but I find I must try, or I shall go mad with the weight of what I am carrying." The lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, and she saw that his eyes were not the cold, dark blue of his guarded moments, but warm, achingly warm, the colour of summer sky, and she understood with a clarity that stole her breath that he was trying to tell her something he had no words for, that this man who commanded rooms with his presence and silenced enemies with a glance was standing before her stripped of all his armour, vulnerable in a way she suspected no one had ever seen him. And she reached out without thinking, and laid her hand against his chest where his heart beat as wildly as her own. Eleanor felt his heart beneath her palm, felt it racing to match her own, and the sensation was so intimate, so achingly real, that for a moment she could not breathe, could not think, could only stand there in the storm-lit library with her hand pressed to his chest, and her grey eyes locked with his blue ones. And then Henry spoke again, his voice rough and halting, as though each word was being dragged from somewhere deep within him, somewhere he had kept locked and guarded for so long that the very act of opening it caused him pain. "I have watched you," he said, and his hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his heart, his fingers warm and strong and trembling almost imperceptibly. "I have watched you with Thomas, watched the way you kneel to his level and speak to him as though his thoughts matter, watched the way you learned the names of every servant in the household and remembered the details of their lives, watched the way you read poetry in the library when you think yourself alone, and I have found myself standing outside doors simply to hear your voice, found myself arranging my days around the moments when I might see you, found myself thinking of you when I wake and when I sleep and in every hour between, and I do not know when it happened. Eleanor, I do not know when this arrangement we made became something I could not bear to lose, but I know that it has. I know that you have become essential to me in ways I never anticipated and never sought, and cannot now imagine living without." The lightning flashed again, illuminating the tears that had begun to slip down Eleanor's cheeks, and she heard herself whisper, her voice breaking on the words, "I promised myself I would not hope. You have made me break that promise." And Henry's expression shifted, something cracking open behind his eyes, something that looked like wonder and fear and desperate longing all tangled together, and he reached up with his free hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "I know I am not skilled at this," he said, his voice dropping lower still, rough as gravel, tender as a prayer. "I know I have given you formality when you deserved warmth, silence when you deserved words, distance when you deserved closeness. But I am asking you now, Eleanor, I am asking if you might find it in your heart to accept what I am trying so poorly to offer, which is everything, which is all of me, which is a love I did not believe myself capable of feeling until you walked into my life with your grey eyes and your quiet dignity and your courage that puts my own to shame." He paused, and she saw him swallow hard, saw the muscle flex near his ear, saw him run his hand through his hair in that gesture she had come to recognize as the sign of emotion too great to contain. And then he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I love you, Eleanor. I love you. and I find I cannot go another moment without telling you so, without asking if there is any possibility, any hope at all, that you might one day come to feel the same." And Eleanor, who had spent 3 years building walls around her heart, who had sworn never to hope again, who had accepted a practical arrangement because she believed herself unworthy of anything more, looked up at this man who had defended her before the world, and remembered small details and shown her his hidden tenderness. And she said, her voice steady despite her tears, her grey eyes warming to silver, "I do not need to come to feel the same, Henry. I already do. I have loved you for longer than I knew. I love you now. I will love you for all the days that remain to me." And then his mouth found hers, and the storm raged on outside, but neither of them heard it, lost as they were in each other, in the truth finally spoken, in the hope finally allowed to bloom. The morning after the storm dawned clear and golden, the world washed clean by rain, and Eleanor woke in Henry's arms with sunlight streaming through the windows of the master bedroom, where she had never slept before, where the arrangement they had made had never included her presence, and yet here she was, her head pillowed on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, his hand resting warm and possessive on the curve of her hip, and she lay still for a long moment, simply breathing, simply existing in this new reality where hope was no longer a wound but a gift, where love was no longer a transaction but a truth spoken aloud in a storm-lit library and sealed with kisses that had tasted of tears and joy and the overwhelming relief of finally being seen. Henry stirred beside her, and she felt his lips press against her hair, felt the rumble of his voice in his chest as he murmured her name, just her name, Eleanor, spoken with such tenderness that her eyes filled with tears all over again, and she tilted her face up to find him watching her with those eyes that were no longer guarded, no longer the cold, dark blue of a man who had armored his heart against the world, but warm, achingly warm, the color of summer sky, the color she had come to recognize as the truth of him that he showed only to her. They rose late and descended to breakfast together, and if the servants noticed that the Duchess emerged from the Duke's chambers rather than her own, their faces showed nothing but carefully concealed satisfaction, and Eleanor caught the housekeeper exchanging a meaningful glance with the butler that spoke of wages won and hopes fulfilled, and she felt warmth bloom in her chest at the realization that the household had been watching, waiting, hoping for exactly this. Harriet was waiting in the morning room when they entered, her embroidery in her lap, and her sharp eyes taking in everything, the way Henry's hand rested at the small of Eleanor's back, the way Eleanor's grey eyes had warmed to silver and stayed there, the way they moved together now as though the distance that had once separated them had simply ceased to exist, and when Eleanor met her former governess's gaze, Harriet smiled, that knowing smile that had seen through pretense since Eleanor was a child, and said quietly, "Did I not tell you, child, that man has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you? He did not know it then, but he knows it now." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes again as she crossed the room to embrace the woman who had been mother and friend and counsel through her darkest years, whispering her thanks against Harriet's shoulder, while Henry watched with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that Eleanor's heart turned over in her chest. Later that morning, Thomas burst into the drawing-room, where Eleanor sat reading, his small face alight with excitement, and he threw himself into her arms, crying, "Mamma, Mamma, Papa says we are to have a picnic in the garden, all 3 of us together." And over his tousled dark head, Eleanor met Henry's eyes where he stood, in the doorway, and she saw in his gaze the same wonder she felt, the same grateful disbelief that this was real, that this was theirs, that the practical arrangement they had made had somehow, impossibly, become everything neither of them had dared to hope for. The weeks that followed their declaration unfolded like the pages of a story Eleanor had never dared to imagine for herself. each day bringing new discoveries about the man she had married and the life they were building together. And she found herself marveling at how completely everything had changed while remaining, in its essential nature, exactly the same. For Henry was still the man who showed his love through action rather than flowery words. Still the man who remembered small details and acted upon them without acknowledgement. Still the man whose jaw tightened when he suppressed emotion and whose hand ran through his dark hair when he allowed himself to feel. But now these gestures were accompanied by others, by the brush of his fingers against hers when they passed in hallways, by the way he would pause in doorways simply to look at her as though memorizing her face, by the low murmur of her name, spoken like a prayer, when they lay together in the darkness of the master bedroom that had become their shared sanctuary. The season continued around them, a whirl of balls and dinners and afternoon calls, and Eleanor navigated it all with a confidence she had not known she possessed, her spine straight and her chin level, not from practiced dignity born of necessity, but from the genuine assurance of a woman who knew herself loved, who knew that the man beside her would step between her and any threat, social or otherwise, without hesitation or regret. Society watched them with fascination, the whispers now carrying a different tenor entirely, for the tale of the Duke's defence of his Duchess had spread through London's drawing rooms like wildfire, embellished with each retelling until it had achieved the status of legend, and wherever Eleanor went she felt the weight of curious gazes, some envious, some admiring, all acknowledging that the girl Clarence Pemberton had discarded had risen not merely to a title, but to something far more rare and precious, a marriage that appeared, against all expectation, to be a genuine love match. Thomas flourished in the warmth of their happiness, his small face bright with the security of a child who knows himself surrounded by love. And Eleanor found herself treasuring the moments when the three of them were together, Henry's severity softening as he watched his son, her own heart full to bursting with gratitude for this family she had never expected to claim as her own. Harriet observed it all with the knowing satisfaction of a woman whose predictions had proven true, and one afternoon, finding Eleanor alone in the morning room of the London townhouse, she settled into the chair beside her former charge and said quietly, her sharp eyes gentle with affection, "You have become the woman your mother always hoped you would be, child. Not merely a duchess, but a woman who knows her own worth, and has found a man worthy of her heart." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she reached for the locket that rested against her skin. The locket that now held not only her mother's portrait, but a pressed white camellia, placed there by Henry's own hands on a morning when he had found her in the conservatory and had said, his voice rough with the emotion he still struggled to express, that he wanted her to carry something of their life together, close to her heart always. The years that followed wrote themselves across the pages of Eleanor's life in ink of gold and silver, in the laughter of children, and the quiet moments of a love that only deepened with time. And as she stood one autumn afternoon in the garden of Blackwell Park, with the afternoon light slanting through the ancient oaks, and the scent of rain-washed earth rising around her, she marvelled at how completely the world had transformed since that grey April day, when she had wept alone on a bench in Hyde Park, never imagining that sorrow would prove to be the doorway to joy. Thomas was 12 now, tall and serious like his father, but with a warmth that came more easily to him, and he stood beside his younger siblings in the garden, helping little Catherine gather fallen leaves, while baby William toddled between them on unsteady legs. And Eleanor watched them with a heart so full she thought it might overflow, these children who called her mother, this family she had never dared to dream would be hers. Henry emerged from the house and crossed the lawn toward her, and even after all these years, the sight of him still made her breath catch, the silver at his temples more pronounced now, the severity of his features softened by the happiness that had become his constant companion. And when he reached her side, he did not speak, but simply took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in that gesture that had become as natural as breathing, and together they watched their children play in the golden light. She thought sometimes of Clarence Pemberton, who had grown bitter and small in his loveless marriage, whose name was spoken in drawing-rooms with pity rather than respect, and she felt not triumph but something closer to gratitude, for his cruelty had set her on the path that led to Henry, and she could not regret any step of a journey that had brought her here. The locket still rested against her heart, her mother's portrait now accompanied by the pressed camellia Henry had placed there, and she touched it sometimes when she needed to remember how far she had come, from the girl who had vowed never to hope, to the woman who had learned that hope was not a wound, but a gift, not a weakness, but a courage, not a foolish dream, but the very foundation of a life well lived. Henry lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers, and when she looked up at him, she saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt, the same grateful disbelief that this was real, that this was theirs, that love had found them both when they had ceased to look for it, and had proven itself not in grand declarations, but in the accumulation of ordinary moments, in morning light and evening fires, in the weight of a child's hand and the warmth of a shared silence, in the simple, profound miracle of being truly known and truly loved. Thank you for walking this path with Eleanor and Henry, for believing in love that grows from respect and trust, for understanding that the deepest happiness often comes not from the fulfillment of our expectations, but from the grace of discovering something far better than we ever dared to imagine.